Okay, so probably in slight differences to what we've seen for most of the conference, I'll be taking a mental health angle. In fact, Elizabeth has told me that I'm the first person to talk so directly about mental health. As Carlotta said, I work with qualitative methods and I'm based at the Institute for Women's Health, so it's a nice place to be for this type of research. I don't want this to be, and I think this is really important to start from the beginning by saying this, I don't want this to be a massive mansplaining event where I am telling women how to think about women's mental health. I'm not. I'm telling the institutions that govern mental health that we're doing mental health wrong. We are short of time, so I might skip through some slides, but basically mental health in context at the moment, what we see is that by 2020, the WHO expects it to be the second leading cause of global burden in terms of disease. And there are various factors which contribute to mental health issues. In the UK, almost 45% of people believe that they have a diagnosable mental health condition. Just over 36% of people actually identify with one. And 20% of men and 35% of women are diagnosed with a mental illness at any one time. Now, on the third slide in, we've already identified a gendered issue. So what is the gender, sort of the context of gender around this? Well, the context is that depression, no matter what country you study it in, will have far more women, in fact, double the amount of women to men presenting with it. But drug and alcohol dependence is far higher in men across the globe. What we know is that women are presenting far more often to psychological services, but that suicide is the leading cause of men in this country between the ages of 5 and 50 years of age. So what we think, and the common school of thought, is that men are self-medicating with drugs and alcohol, and when that doesn't work, then completion of suicide is the way out. And mental health practices are just inherently gendered. We have a societal story about a neurotic woman, so the woman who gets caught up in the very little things of life, and the psychotic man. So we see this in films all of the time. The man with a tinfoil on his head, you know, trying to prevent aliens from stealing his thoughts. We see these narratives played out. And these have been projected with sort of the hysterical being aligned to women and the shell-shocked men. Mental health is a problem that we see every single day. And here are some common ones. And I guarantee you, when you see these mental health disorders, you will put them into male and female. And they look roughly like this. You're far more likely to associate anxiety and eating disorders with females, whereas you're far more likely to see post-traumatic stress disorder, autism spectrum in men. But recent times are changing this. But what I wanted to talk about was one gendered issue at the moment, which is trauma. Trauma is an obvious point of psychological distress, and it's quite obviously gendered. In the UK military personnel, in fact, a study that came out of this very university suggests that there is a 4% prevalence rate of post-traumatic stress disorder in the UK military personnel. That compares with about 20% of the personnel having normal symptoms of mental health conditions and 13% dependence on alcohol. But because of the military links, we associate post-traumatic stress disorder much more with men than we do with women. So where are the women when it comes to trauma? Well, here's a few. Childhood adversities are much more likely to affect women, and I was actually lucky enough to study under John Reed, Richard Bentle, Peter Kinderman and colleagues at the University of Liverpool. Rape, women are much more likely to be the victim of. Traumatic childbirth, tocophobia, so the clinical fear of childbirth, and indirect exposure to trauma. Now, this is an interesting one because it links to military personnel as well. And for those of you in the room who don't know about mental health conditions, post-traumatic stress disorder is a reaction to being in direct threat of one's life or seeing that somebody else's life threatened. And it presents as quite intrusive thoughts, paranoia, and hypervigilance. So women are very present in trauma situations, but we don't talk about them as much as we talk about men's. And why is this? Well, if we look at a bit of history, Eritreus started to talk about the womb in the 1st century, who was later taken over by Serenus, who was unofficially the first gynecologist. And what they said was that the womb used to move within the body and it would suffocate women from the inside, which would lead to hysteria or madness. If we look through an anthropological lens, what we see is that women were seen as the givers of life through birth, but also those who presided over death through using medicines and either curing the sick or, if they were unable to cure the sick, then being the ones who dealt with the death. But this was taken away from them over time, and this was given to men. And so shamans become men who were slightly ostracized, but they weren't women. And then we look to the women's suffrage movement. Before women's suffrage, pretty much anything a woman did which was seen as dangerous or to be possessed, asylum or death was the outcome. So we have a really bad history of looking at women's mental health, and it's not helped by Sigmund Freud, who, whilst is noted for his work in psychoanalysis, his work was based on his own personal experiences and his own conservative ideologies about women's place in society. In his work, he worked with mainly middle-class aristocratic women who were presenting to his service as a psychiatrist because they were feeling low in mood. But what he developed in his work was this idea of a neurotic woman, that there was no complaint, but that they were presenting with a complaint. And this sort of, this rhetoric has lasted until today. But what we know from even more recent studies, I mean, this one's quite old, it's 1982, but social factors as poor marriage quality, low intimacy, joblessness, they all contribute significantly to poor mental health. And it could be a reason why more women present to mental health services than men, because these factors are much more likely to affect women. So where do we see today? Well, we see a presentation of anxieties about health, which is really quite written off and dismissed as sort of the worried well or hypochondriacs. You know, this is a massive hangover effect from the hundreds of years of treating women's health, women's health and women's mental health as not as important as men. And the usual presentation of this worried well patient tends to be a middle to upper class woman who is seeking medical attention for an affliction she believes she has, but that there's otherwise nothing wrong. But the presentation of this should be seen as a real clinical problem, because there might be a deep-rooted psychological issue here at play. What's more worrying is that actually out of the men and women who go to primary care services, proportionately, double the amount of women will be medicated using antidepressants to men. And I don't know if anybody knows about the male gaze here. So Laura Mulvey in 1975 introduced it about film and looking at film. So basically, the way that we look at women in mental health situations is exactly the same. The woman looks to herself, to view herself, for example, in a mirror. That's reflected back to the heteronormative society that we live in. The heteronormative society frames it within the ideal feminine or the desirable female, and then that's reflected back to the woman who initially first viewed herself. So she's the last person to see the image of herself which society has created. So the history is pretty bad, but what of the future? Well, we need to stop pathologizing as a problem to be dealt with. We need to start looking at it as a serious psychological epidemic to be understood. But more importantly, what we need to do is look at different lenses, because activist approaches to the feminist psychology approaches have been sort of disregarded as exaggerated, and gendered attitudes to feminine psychology has been looked at as insignificant. So in a paper that's coming out later this year, I've actually compiled some definitions. I'll let them you read them yourselves, but feminist psychology and feminine psychology are the two main pillars of the psychology of women. Female psychology, I can only find 2 books which are published on female psychology. Now, if anybody has any others, I would really like to know, but I can only find 2. But I think this is the lens which, and using my definition, could help us to do a better job of women's mental health services, because it's a cradle-to-grave approach. It frames psychological well-being positively. It frames mental health positively because it looks at patterns of distress and it looks at patterns of strength as well. Thank you. And I'm going to evidence this with 4 studies I've been attached to. So the postpartum specific anxiety scale, which is led by Dr. Vicky Fallon at the University of Liverpool. This was a longitudinal piece of work where women were interviewed 3 times, pre and post birth. And the scale has been developed with these 4 constructs. And what we do here is we actually capture the transitionary nature of pregnancy. And we look at the psychological adjustments required in order to maintain a good mental health. Second piece of work that I've done on midwife grief. Now, Laura Zeiderstein, I have huge respect for. What she did in 1995 is she wrote an article saying we need to be more accepting of women who grieve in the profession for midwifery. She didn't actually do a sort of conceptual model, this is mine, but she focused on what would be the first 2 columns and the last column. What I noticed was that there was a problem because what she didn't take into account was the gendered phenomenon of midwifery. So by adding in this possible saliency of motherhood saliency, we demonstrate that there's a deep-rooted connection between woman midwife and woman patient. And that the actual loss of a patient doesn't just happen as one incident, but there's a relationship that's been built over time. So the effect of that mental health presentation at the end is cumulative. This was actually my master's thesis. In brief, I did 12 in-depth interviews with never married women, some of whom were childless, through either choice or circumstance. So some of them had chosen not to have children as well. First analysis found that in terms of their gender, they had felt different. So it's very basic, but that's the essence of it. Second analysis was that they described themselves differently to other women, and they described womanhood differently. And the third analysis looked at their social networks, which they found to be differently to their unexpected life courses. So this was an under-researched population. Just finally, spousal loss. What we tend to see in widows is that they have this social isolation after the loss of their partner. We interviewed some European widows based in the UK. We found that they had this social expansion. So there's something different going on here as well. So when we look at these in relation to my definition, so the postpartum specific anxiety scale links in really well to the lived experience and the life course. The motherhood saliency review looks at patterns and trends of mental health. My master's thesis looks at adaptations to gender identity challenges, and European Widows in the UK looks at the challenges over life course transitions and across cultures. So whilst they all come under a female psychology bracket, they're clearly evidencing parts of my definition. But why is this important? And these are my final 2 slides, so I promise I'll be quiet soon. Well, basically, for too long, we've written off female mental health as unimportant or exaggerated. The discourse around women's mental health is particularly stigmatising, and women's mental health issues have been simply overlooked. This approach enables women to utilise the platforms that we have as researchers and as clinicians and as educators and as policymakers to tell their own mental health narratives which are otherwise left uncaptured. And how do we use it to affect change? Well, my argument would be that we advocate for a more open approach to involving women in mental health research and educating researchers and clinicians to engage women in the policy-making processes and in the research-making processes. We need to consult with clinical and academic partners in order to produce policy which is suitable for the people who it's affecting. And as part of a side role, I edit a journal for British Mensa. We're turning 1 year old on Wednesday, tomorrow, and I wrote an article in it which ends with this statement, and I'll just leave that with you.